What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
I used to think that getting older meant lowering your expectations, not because life gets worse, but because you just learn to stop waiting for things from people who never show up when it matters. This year, my birthday fell on a Tuesday, and I went into that week with the kind of numb acceptance that comes from years of watching my parents forget or minimize it while moving heaven and earth for my younger sister Amber. I didn't expect a big gift. I didn't even expect a dinner. All I thought, maybe, was that they'd remember to call, maybe send a quick text, something that at least acknowledged I existed. Instead, the day came and went in complete silence from both of them, as if the date had been erased from the calendar. No message, no voicemail, nothing. The only ping my phone made that day was from my bank reminding me about an upcoming payment, and that, in some twisted way, felt like it summed everything up perfectly. What really made it sting wasn't the forgetting itself, because truthfully, they've done that before, but the complete absence of even an accidental sign that they cared. My mom is usually at least good for a Facebook post about how time flies or how she can't believe her baby is another year older, the kind of post that's less about you and more about her looking like a thoughtful mother to everyone else. But this time there was nothing, and by the next morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was fine, that maybe they'd call a day late and claim they mixed up the date, or say they were busy but wanted to celebrate soon. And then 2 weeks later, I saw the pictures. Amber's birthday had just passed, and my parents had thrown her a yacht party. Not a dinner at a nice restaurant, not a backyard barbecue, but an actual chartered yacht, catered, decorated, full of friends and extended family, with photographers, a DJ, and God knows how much champagne. The photos were everywhere, tagged and shared, my mom and dad grinning like they'd just won the lottery, Amber in the center of every shot like she was some kind of celebrity, and I couldn't help but notice that every single cousin, aunt, and uncle had been invited. Every single one except me. It wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. They knew I'd see it, and on some level, I think they wanted me to. That's the part people never understand when they say, maybe they just forgot, or maybe it wasn't personal. Sometimes it is personal. Sometimes people go out of their way to make a point, and my parents have been making the same point for decades, that Amber is the daughter they are proud of, the one worth investing in, the one who gets the celebrations and the public praise. I've always been the backup option, the placeholder, the afterthought they don't bother to disguise. I sat there scrolling through every tagged picture, every comment about how beautiful the party was, and how lucky Amber was to have such supportive parents, and something in me shifted. I could have told myself it didn't matter, that birthdays are just another day, that I'm too old to care about parties or attention, but that's the kind of self-talk that keeps you stuck in a cycle of taking whatever scraps people decide to throw at you. The truth is, I did care. I cared because it wasn't about the party, it was about being shown, once again, that my existence was optional in their world, and if I wanted to have any kind of relationship with them, it would always be on their terms. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about every time I had dropped everything to help them, every time I'd rearranged my schedule to show up for Amber, every birthday, graduation, job promotion, or breakup of hers where I'd been present, even when I was dealing with my own mess. And I realized that not once had they done the same for me. It's strange how quiet those realizations are. You expect them to feel like some dramatic moment, like slamming a door or shouting in someone's face, but instead they just sit there, heavy and undeniable, until you realize the only thing left to do is act on them. I didn't tell them I was upset. I didn't send a sarcastic text or make a passive-aggressive comment on Facebook. I didn't confront them because I'd done that before and nothing had changed. Instead, I made a decision, a very calm, very final decision, that I wasn't going to give them another chance to make me feel like I was worth less than my sister. For years, I had been playing the role they assigned me, the good sport who didn't make waves, the older sister who was expected to be understanding and selfless because Amber was the baby and needed the attention. But I'm not a child anymore, and I don't have to sit at a table where the chair they've given me is broken. So I decided I wouldn't. I wouldn't attend the next family gathering, I wouldn't answer the next guilt trip phone call, and I wouldn't keep myself available for their emergencies while being invisible for everything else. The thing about people who are used to taking you for granted is they never expect you to leave. They expect you to complain, to cry, maybe to pull away for a little while, but not to actually cut them off. I knew that walking away would confuse them, maybe even scare them a little, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't giving them an explanation or asking for one. I was just gone. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence, real, deliberate silence, can be a lot louder than any confrontation. So I stopped reaching out. I stopped replying. I removed myself from the group chats where most of the messages were about Amber anyway. I unfollowed the accounts that posted constant reminders of how much better her life supposedly was. And I told myself that if they wanted me in their lives, they would have to figure out why I wasn't there, without me spelling it out for them. I didn't know it at the time, but that decision was going to set off a chain of events that none of us could have predicted. Because as much as my parents liked to pretend I was irrelevant, they were about to find out that I had something they needed, something they couldn't get without me, and by the time they realized it, I had already decided exactly how I was going to use it. When I say I went quiet, I don't mean I staged a dramatic exit or posted some long speech about boundaries and healing, because I've learned that speeches are for people who want applause, and I was not looking for applause, I was looking for peace. So I simply stopped doing all the tiny maintenance tasks that kept me tied to a family that treated me like an optional upgrade, and I started with the simple stuff, the things no one notices until they do, like muting the family group chat where every conversation eventually became a planning session for whatever Amber wanted next, and then I removed my card from the shared food delivery account my mother set up years ago with the cute story that we'd all chip in. Except I was the only one who ever did, and after that I took my name off the video streaming services I had been quietly paying for because my parents never wanted to create their own login since you already have it, honey. And it is surprising how light your phone feels when it stops buzzing with requests and reminders and passive commentary about things that are not your problem. I did not block them, since blocking is loud, and loud makes people feel justified in their outrage, so I kept it clean and polite by doing nothing, which is sometimes the hardest thing, because it leaves their words hanging in the air with no place to land. And you would be amazed how quickly people become uncomfortable when their usual hooks do not catch, and the first few days were quiet enough that I thought maybe this would be easier than I expected, but then the calls started, not the casual calls, the urgent ones, the repeated missed calls from my mother followed by texts with the same 3 words she always uses when she needs something from me, call me now, and I watched them pile up and I did not respond. Because I wanted to see whether this sudden urgency was about me or about something they were trying to control. What most people do not know, because I never made a big deal out of it, is that when Amber wanted to buy that storefront for her salon, the bank would not give her good terms without a stronger cosigner, and guess who stepped up? Not because anyone begged me with tears and promises, but because at the time I truly believed that families help each other, and if I had the credit and the steady income that could make the numbers work, then lending my name would be a way to prove that I was not the selfish, difficult one they loved to imply I was whenever I asked for basic consideration, so I signed. And I remember the relief on my parents' faces, not gratitude exactly, more like satisfaction that the machine was working again. And I remember telling myself it was fine because paperwork is invisible once it is filed, until it is not. When my mother finally left a voicemail instead of just barking orders in text, her voice had that bright edge she uses when she is pretending not to panic, the one where every sentence sounds like a sale at a department store. And she said the bank had sent a letter about a routine refinance, which is code for payments are going up and we need a better deal, and they needed my signature as soon as possible because rates were changing after a certain date and if we missed it the terms would jump, and then she tossed in that Amber was so stressed and not sleeping, which is the kind of emotional coupon my mother loves to wave for a discount on basic decency, and I listened to that message twice and then 3 times. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to hear the part where she asked how I was, and it never came. It is amazing how quickly a person who supposedly does not matter becomes essential when there is a document they cannot move without her, and within a week the tone shifted from fake cheerful to chastising concern, with my father sending a long text about how family is about showing up and how this is not the time to be stubborn, which is funny if you have lived my life, because apparently every time I asked for equal treatment it was the wrong time, and now that they're favorite child's business was staring down a nasty interest adjustment, suddenly my silence was hurtful, and that word sat there like a dare, because I could have called and said, "Sure, let me sign right away," and we could have moved on like the yacht never happened. But then I would have taught them the same lesson I taught them every other year, which is that no matter what they do, I will be there to fix it. So I did something small that changed everything, and before you roll your eyes at the word small, understand that the most powerful moves are usually administrative, not dramatic, and I logged into the bank portal for cosigners. The one I never used after the closing because I pretended it didn't exist, and I updated my contact preferences so that every notice, every delinquency alert, every refinance request, and every change of terms would be sent to me directly and require my explicit consent in writing with a notarized signature, not a quick e-sign that some eager loan officer could hustle through with a casual, "will loop her in." And then I filed a written instruction with the bank's compliance unit stating that I would not authorize any modification without a 30-day review period and a physical meeting at a branch, and I copied that to their underwriting team and certified it by mail. And I cannot fully explain the calm that settled on me when I walked out of the post office, because I knew that for the first time the timeline would run on my clock. The messages kept coming, and I ignored them, not out of cruelty, but because I was done training them to treat me like a concierge who answers faster the more they complain, and when Amber finally called from a number I did not recognize, I let it go to voicemail, and she left a speech that tried to be polite but couldn't hide the part where she said that if I didn't help, the payment jump would crush her for a while, and she did not deserve that after everything she had done for me. A sentence so upside down I had to sit down, and I replayed in my head every airport ride, every babysitting favor, every holiday I spent cheering her on while nobody noticed that my own life had milestones too. And I realized she had built a story where I was always standing on her shoulders when the truth was I had been the floor she walked on. Since they love public perception more than private accountability, I delivered my first small revenge in a place they could not ignore, and I did it without calling names or making a scene. Because all I did was update my LinkedIn to remove my parents as references and to add a simple line under volunteer work that said I provide pro bono advice to small business owners on protecting their credit and avoiding predatory co-signing. And then I shared a short post, no names, no specifics. Nothing actionable, just a clear message that I would no longer participate in financial arrangements that required my credit while denying me basic respect. And within an hour, I had a polite email from the bank's assistant branch manager confirming receipt of my compliance letter and CCNG my parents on the note, which meant they now knew that the fast lane was closed and the toll booth had a new operator. By the end of that day, my mother texted a photo of a calendar reminder that said, "Call Lauren," as if scheduling care could substitute for actually feeling it, and my father sent a line about being disappointed in my behavior, which made me laugh out loud in a way that surprised me because it felt like the first true exhale I had taken in months, and I still did not answer, because they were not talking to me, they were talking to the version of me who would rush to make their problem smaller. And she was gone. And while they scrambled to figure out new dates and new terms and new ways to push me, I started counting the days to the deadline they swore we could not miss, not to be cruel, but to prove to myself that I could hold a boundary even when the ground started to shake. That night, just as I was thinking maybe the storm would pass with a few more guilt trips and a last-minute meeting, Amber left another voicemail, this time with a new sentence she had clearly rehearsed with my parents. A sentence that was supposed to scare me back into line, because she said the bank had warned them that if the refinance did not go through by the end of the month, the rate would reset and the penalty clause would hit, and then she said the part they thought was the magic phrase, the one meant to yank me by the collar, that my credit would be impacted too, and if I loved my precious score so much, I should think about that, and I smiled, because I had been thinking about that for a long time. And I had already taken steps that she did not know about, and the next move would be theirs, unless I decided to make one they would never see coming. What finally pushed this whole thing from annoying family drama into a situation where I could feel the gears turning in my favor was not a speech or an argument or some emotional showdown in a living room. It was a call from a junior loan officer who clearly thought I was going to be easy to manage because he opened with the friendly script they use on customers who are not supposed to ask questions, telling me the refinance was basically done. That my parents had handled everything and all they needed was my quick electronic signature so they could lock the rate, which I know is their way of turning pressure into urgency, and I let him talk for a while, nodding at nothing. Before I said very calmly that he would not be getting an electronic signature from me under any circumstances, that all communication needed to be in writing, and that any attempt to move documents without my written consent would result in a formal complaint to their compliance department and the state regulator, and the pause that followed let me know he had assumed I did not understand the leverage I was holding. People think leverage is about money, but most of the time real leverage is about timing and paperwork, and because I had already filed the notice that any modification required a physical meeting and a 30-day review period. His little push to slip an e-sign past me was not just annoying, it was a violation of a written instruction on file, so I asked him, very directly, to send me the complete refinance package, not a summary, not a cover page, but the full stack with every schedule and rider, and when he tried to tell me that was not standard, I repeated the request and added that I would be copying the email to the bank's compliance office. And funny enough, the full package arrived within the hour with a sudden flurry of courteous language that did not exist when they thought I was a rubber stamp. I took a slow breath and settled in with coffee and a notepad, and I did the unglamorous thing almost no one does in families like mine, which is reading every line of every page as if my life depended on it, because in a way it did. And that is when I found the sentence that made my hands shake in that quiet, controlled way where you know you are about to change the weather, a small clause tucked into the disclosures indicating that consent had been obtained from all co-obligors via an electronic authentication sent on a certain date, a date I recognized because it was the same day my mother had sent me a series of "call me now" texts followed by silence when I did not answer. And at the bottom of that clause was a reference number I did not recognize next to what looked like a partial authentication ID, and I sat there staring at it while the realization built that someone had either tried to push an e-signature without me, or worse, had allowed the system to register that an attempt had been made without verifying it was mine. I could have exploded. I could have called my mother and said things I would not be able to walk back, but instead I wrote an email with the kind of precise language that makes institutions sit up, citing the document identifier, quoting the clause, and stating that I had not provided any electronic consent, that I had previously instructed the bank in writing that no e-signature would be valid, and that I was now requesting an immediate audit of access logs, the certification of all consent events tied to my name, and the placement of a fraud hold on any refinance activity pending an internal investigation, and I copied the compliance officer, the branch manager, and the generic address for the state oversight office. And then I hit send and watched the clock, because leverage does not work unless you know how long it takes for a fuse to reach the dynamite. Less than 2 hours later, I received a phone call from a far more senior person who did not try to sell me anything and who opened, correctly, by apologizing and confirming a temporary pause on all activity. And when I asked whether any electronic consent had been recorded on my file, she said there had been an initiated event, but no completed signature, and that this was already being reviewed because of the clash with my prior instruction. And I told her, in a tone I have reserved for jobs where someone tries to take credit for my work, that I expected any future outreach to go through me in writing, and that I would be requiring in-person verification for whatever happened next, which she agreed to without argument. And then, because the universe enjoys timing, my mother started calling again while I was still on the line, back to back, as if she could feel the door starting to close. I did not answer her calls, but I did send one text, short for me but clear, telling her that the bank had put a hold on the refinance for an audit, that no one would be moving anything without me in the room, and that when they were ready to discuss this like adults, I would propose terms that reflected the reality of how things had been handled, and she shot back a series of messages in that brittle, cheerful tone she uses for strangers, calling it a misunderstanding and telling me that I was overreacting and that we can fix this as a family, and I looked at those words and felt that click you get when a door finally locks, because there it was, the old script trying to reassert itself. The script where they set the problem and I supplied the solution while pretending not to notice the insult underneath. Since I was done with that script, I made a different move that looks petty from the outside, but was as precise as a scalpel. And I forwarded the bank's freeze notice to my parents and to Amber using an email thread with a subject line that could be screenshotted without shame, and I added a line that said, very simply, that from this point on I would only meet in a public place with a third-party notary present, and that any agreement would include written acknowledgments of responsibility. Because if they loved public displays so much for parties and announcements, they could handle a little public accountability for once, and then I turned off my phone for a while and let the silence do the work it was designed to do. By evening the messages had evolved from faux cheerful to rattled bargaining, with my father offering to explain everything and Amber asking whether I would at least consider a quick signature to stop the damage, because she had payroll to meet and vendors to calm. And I almost felt bad for a second, but then I remembered the yacht photos and the way my birthday had vanished like it was an inconvenience, and I realized that if I gave in now I would be teaching them that even a fraud attempt could be smoothed over if they talked fast enough, and I am done being the smoothing over department. So I wrote back one final note of the day offering a single meeting window at the end of the week at a neutral coffee shop near the branch. With the notary I had already booked and the compliance email copied so there would be a record, and I ended it by saying that I would bring my terms in writing and that if they were not prepared to accept them, we could all enjoy the new rate together. That was my revenge for the day, not dramatic, not cruel, just a clean reset of power that put the problem exactly where it belonged, and as I watched the read receipts stack up I knew they would come. Because they always come when the image of losing face is louder than the discomfort of saying sorry, and when my father finally replied that they would be there and that we should keep this private, I smiled at the line I typed back, telling him that privacy is earned by honesty and that this time there would be witnesses, and then I closed my laptop and let the quiet settle, already writing the list that would make them decide, in front of a stranger with a stamp, whether they wanted the signature badly enough to pay for it in something more valuable than money. I picked a coffee shop close to the branch because I wanted the walk to the notary to feel short for them and long for me, not because I needed the drama, but because I needed the timing, and when my parents arrived with Amber in tow, all three of them wearing the faces they use for church and charity banquets, I said hello like we were regular people meeting for something boring. Then I laid a folder on the table and told them we were going to do this like adults, which meant no raised voices, no rewrites of history, and no sudden emergencies that required me to forget what had been done. And because I knew they would try to make this about speed and logistics, I started with the one thing that would slow them down and force them to look me in the eye, which was the list of terms printed in clear, large type, with bullet points so there would be no confusion, and I watched the moment my father realized I was not bluffing when he hit the first line and his mouth tightened in that way. That has always meant he wants to lecture me. My terms were not complicated, they were just specific in a way my family hates because specificity removes wiggle room, so I said that before any refinance documents were signed or even reviewed, there would be 3 signed acknowledgments, notarized today, and 1 public action completed while we sat there, and the acknowledgments were written in plain language that even a loan officer would appreciate. First, that my parents had engaged in long-term unequal treatment that harmed me. Second, that a refinance attempt had been initiated without honoring my written instruction, and third, that any future requests for my signature on anything would be considered null unless delivered by certified mail with 30 days' notice. And then I slid the last page across the table, the one they were already dreading, the public action, which required my parents to post a short apology on the same social media accounts where they had broadcast Amber's yacht celebration. An apology that did not name me as dramatic or sensitive, did not use the word misunderstanding, and did not beg for privacy, just a clear statement that they had failed to acknowledge my birthday and that they were sorry for the pain that caused, and they would do better. I did not ask them to grovel, because that would give them something to weaponize later. I asked them to tell the truth, and I made it clear that the apology needed to go up before we walked to the branch, because I was done signing things on the promise that they would follow through later, and my father said the words I expected, something about how this was not necessary and how family matters should not be aired in public, and I told him I agreed entirely, which is why they should have kept my birthday private too instead of ignoring it so loudly that it became a public insult, and Amber jumped in with that soft voice she uses when she wants to seem reasonable, asking whether there was any way to keep it between us, maybe a letter, maybe a dinner. And I told her dinners are where you celebrate people you respect, not where you erase what happened, so we were going to stick with the plan. Since this was not just about feelings, I added the practical demands that would make any loan officer nod, because I required that the refinance move me to a non-recourse position with a written release of liability once the new loan funded. That Amber added a guarantor who was not me for any interim exposure, that my parents put up a small certificate of deposit as collateral to cover any gap during the transition, and that until the release was filed, all financial statements and notices would come to me as primary contact, which meant I would know the truth in real time, and, because I am not naive, I required that Amber prepare 3 post-dated cashier's checks right now. One to reimburse the year of streaming and delivery charges I had carried for the family, one to repay an old emergency loan I had given her during her first expansion when things were tight, and one nominal check for $1, symbolic and legal, to acknowledge that my time and signature had value, and I watched her flush at that last one because she knew exactly what it meant. My mother tried to make it about love, asking if I really needed money to forgive, and I said no, I needed evidence that I was done being the free resource they only noticed when it broke, and I added one more condition that was not financial at all, which was that my parents agree to 3 family counseling sessions, not because I believed therapy would magically fix everything overnight, but because I wanted a paper trail that showed we had at least attempted to rebuild in a way that did not require me to swallow everything like I always had, and when my father laughed and said counseling was for people who had real problems, I said that is exactly what people say when they are the problem, and then I let the silence do its work. Here is the part one had planned for, the pivot where they would try to negotiate the apology into something vague and soft, and when my mother suggested a line about miscommunications around celebrations, I slid my phone across the table with the pre-written text already drafted in their voice, simple and polite, and I told her she could copy it word for word or she could write her own, but it needed to be equally clear. And it needed to go live before we walked 2 blocks to the notary, and because I wanted this to feel less like punishment and more like a transaction with receipts, I pulled out a small tripod and set my phone on the table with the camera off, but the screen facing up. And I said for everyone's comfort we would keep the conversation here at a volume that would not disturb the room, and we would keep the notes we signed simple and factual, and my father stared at the tripod like it was a rattlesnake, then he looked at Amber. And Amber looked at the folder with the cashier's check forms I had picked up for her convenience, and she reached for a pen. When the posts went up, they were shorter than I would have written and warmer than I expected, and the comments started arriving almost immediately, a few shocked, a few kind, a few silent with just a heart because people know more than they say. And my mother's hands shook a little as she hit publish, and I felt something uncoil in me that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally being my own advocate. And then I stood, because it was time for the walk, and I reminded them that once we reached the branch we would handle the paperwork exactly as written, no substitutions, no extra forms slid in by a helpful associate, and that I would read every page out loud if necessary so there would be no confusion. And my father nodded with a tight jaw and said we were making a mistake, and I said maybe, but at least it would be mine. We stepped out and Amber whispered that she hoped I was happy, and I said I was not looking for happy, I was looking for fair, and as we reached the door of the branch and the notary stood up from the lobby chair where she had been waiting, my phone buzzed with a notification that my mother's apology post had been shared by a relative who never takes sides, which meant the circle was closing in the way I needed, and I held the door, let them walk in first, and told myself that the only signature happening today would be the one that proved I had finally taken my worth off the clearance rack, and as the notary opened her journal and my father pulled out a pen, I slid one last envelope across the counter, the one he had not seen yet, and said we would start by signing this acknowledgement of the e-signature attempt before we touched a single loan document, and that if anyone hesitated, I would be more than fine letting the deadline hit and leaving the new rate to do the talking. At the counter, I did not raise my voice or dramatize the moment. I simply opened the envelope with the acknowledgement of the attempted electronic consent and slid it to the notary with the kind of steady patience that makes people who cut corners start blinking fast. And when my father muttered that it had all been a misunderstanding, the notary asked, in that gentle official tone they use when they smell smoke, whether each signer had read the statement in full, and I said yes, and then I read it out loud anyway, so there would be no claim later that I had tricked anyone, and when the stamps landed and the ink dried, I could feel the temperature in the room drop, not because anyone was being cruel, but because we had entered a space where facts were going to run the show, and facts have a way of clearing out all the little manipulations that usually keep families humming along in denial. The refinance packet came next, and I took my time because speed is how people smuggle things past you, so I read each page, called out each writer, and when we reached the section that would keep me attached to the debt unless a separate release was filed after funding, I took out the rider I had drafted and had pre-cleared with a very bored but very competent banker on a recorded line, a simple indemnification and release agreement that required 3 things before my name would ever again share a line with Amber's business: a filed release of liability recorded by the lender, a copy of the funded note showing me as removed, and a letter of indemnification from my parents and Amber making me whole for any claim that might appear from the past or the transition, and the branch manager, who had come to hover with the nervous politeness of someone babysitting a grenade, read it, nodded at the notary, and said it was acceptable so long as it was attached at signing and included in the escrow instructions, and I said that was exactly what we were doing, because I was done promising trust where paper should live. Amber handed over the cashier's checks without a speech, which I appreciated more than I expected, and when she reached the last one, the little one for a single $1, she rolled her eyes, but she signed. And I thanked her without sarcasm because sometimes it is the smallest receipt that changes a whole story, and then I opened my folder one more time because I had one last condition that was not about me directly and that, honestly, I had kept for last because I knew it would tell me whether anything we were doing would matter past today, and I said that before we walked those documents into escrow, my parents were going to open a small dedicated account at this very branch with a recurring transfer they could afford, set to support a local program that buys birthday cakes and small gifts for foster kids who often get forgotten, and that the account would be named something boring and clear, not my name, not a vanity title, just a lifeline, and that they would set it up while we stood there so I could see the confirmation, not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted proof they understood what this was really about. My mother started to cry in that quiet way that is half grief and half defense, asking if I needed to make them look like villains forever, and I told her I did not, that in fact this was the first time I was asking them to be the opposite of that. Because if we were going to put money and signatures to work today, we could let them work for a child who has no leverage at all. And my father stared at the floor like he wanted it to swallow him. Then he cleared his throat and asked the manager what it would take, and within a few minutes there was a form on the counter and a confirmation on the screen and a recurring transfer set to start the following month. And I felt the kind of shaky calm that shows up when you realize the thing you came for is actually happening in front of you without a speech. When everything else was finally signed and initialed and stapled and stamped and placed into that thick manila envelope that smells like bureaucracy and relief, I took the pen and signed the refinance in the order we had agreed. First the acknowledgement, then the writer, then the escrow instructions, and only then the main note. And when the last page turned, I looked at my parents and said the line I had rehearsed for weeks, not because I wanted it to sound clever, but because I wanted to. Remember it later when I doubted myself, which I knew I would, and I said that this was the last time my name would save a situation they created without me, that I wished them well in whatever they chose to rebuild. And that I was stepping away not because I hated them, but because I had finally understood that I could love them without letting them use me as a backup plan. The apology posts had already started to circulate in the way small-town networks and extended families and old friends do when something breaks the usual facade, and by evening I had voicemails from cousins I had not heard from in years, some kind, some careful, some simply saying they saw me, and while I was washing a mug and trying to remember what it was like to have a normal Sunday night, my phone lit up with a message from my father that did not sound like him at all, not bossy, not clipped, almost breathless, saying that he and my mother had been talking and that they had made a decision that would make up for the past, and then the unbelievable part came in a second message from my mother. A photo of a draft letter from their attorney offering to transfer a half interest in their house to me immediately if I would agree to come home for dinner next week and let us fix this together, and I just stared at it, because there it was. The thing I had always suspected but never seen. The part where they believed the only way to honor me was to buy me, as if love were a transaction they had finally decided to fund. I did not rage, and I did not gloat, and I did not lecture them about how a deed cannot replace an apology said when nobody is watching. I wrote a single reply that said I appreciated the gesture and that I was not accepting any transfer because I was not for sale, and I added that if they wanted to keep the fund for those kids, they should, and if they wanted counseling, I would sit in those 3 sessions and speak plainly and listen if they did the same, but that I would not be coming to any dinners or parties, and I would not be stepping back into the role they were used to, because the point of today had not been to climb into a better seat at the same table. It had been to walk away from a table that had never been set for me at all. In the days that followed, there were quieter messages and a few angry ones. There was the predictable guilt and the less predictable silence. And then the refinance confirmation arrived with my release attached like a clean bill of health. And I printed it and put it in a folder labeled with one simple word, proof, and I realized I no longer needed anyone to tell me I had done the right thing because the air in my own life felt different, more breathable, and while there will always be a part of me that looks at family and thinks maybe I should have taken the house or let them throw a May-up party with a cake and a band and a speech about reconciliation, there is a louder part now that knows the real win was not the apology or the writer or even the fund. It was the moment I chose to stop arguing for my place in a story that kept writing me as an extra and wrote my own ending instead. And if anyone wants to call that revenge, I will not correct them, but I will tell you it felt like justice, and it felt clean, and when I turned my phone face down that night and let the quiet fill the room, I did not wonder whether I had gone too far. I wondered why it took me so long to do something that simple. And then I slept without setting an alarm for the first time in years.